what's up guys? With the popularity of pistol optics nowadays, I wanted to go over some of the more affordable options that I think are relevant, especially since most people are going to be on a budget and pistol optics can be a little bit expensive depending on what you buy. I do have 3 years experience with Holosun's pistol optics. Most of it has been with the 507C X2 and the 508T X2. I want to go over the specs really quick, so what I say will apply to both of them, then I'll get straight into my review and my thoughts on both of these optics. When you get either the 507C or the 508T, you will have 3 main modes of operation. Your first one is going to be an automatic mode, but you also have a manual mode and a lockout mode. Automatic mode just means the optic will pick a brightness based on your environment, so if you're outside and it's sunny, it will take that brightness up. If it's dark or you're inside, it will bring that brightness down. The manual mode means you can adjust it and pick your brightness, and the lockout mode is just a manual mode, but it will lock it out so you don't accidentally change the brightness by accidentally pressing one of the buttons. One important thing to note is if you want the use of your solar panel, you do have to have it in automatic mode, unfortunately, and if you want the shake awake feature on, you also have to have it in the automatic mode. You're going to have 12 settings. Your first 2 are going to be night vision, then you have 10 daytime settings. You have 3 reticles, you have a dot, you have a circle, and a circle dot. The dot's 2 MOA and the circle is 32 MOA. You also have a side-loaded 1632 battery. Holosun does state that you get 50,000 hours on setting number 6, and that's on the dot reticle. If you have the circle dot, it's going to be 10,000 hours. And it does have an IP67 rating of 1 meter underwater for 30 minutes. The 507C is a 7075 aluminum, and the 508T is solid titanium. Alright, I want to go over how I use the optic, then I'll talk about it. Out of the 3 modes, I use the manual mode. I like to have a set brightness and keep it at that brightness all the time to make sure it's bright enough for a very sunny day, or it's bright enough if I'm in the dark and I have to use my weapon light so I can make sure I see that dot over the beam of my Surefire. The automatic mode does work pretty good, but it still lacks a little bit inside when you're using your weapon light, so that's one reason I do use the manual mode. I've never used the lockout mode just because I've never had an issue of, unintentionally pressing one of the buttons and changing my brightness. And I like to be able to change my brightness very quickly without having to switch the modes of operation. Out of the 12 settings, I always use it on the second brightest setting. That's daylight setting number 9. If it's a very bright Arizona day, maybe I might bump it up to that 10th setting, but it's usually on setting number 9 99% of the time. Out of the 3 reticles, I just use the dot. I can see how some people might like the circle or the circle dot, especially up close, but I just prefer to use the dot. That works good for me, so I just use the dot. Battery life, I know this for a fact. With the 508T, I will get 3 months of battery life. I've had several batteries die because I have tested this a few times to make sure I know the exact length my battery gets before I change it, and my 508T will always die at 3 months, and obviously I change the battery, but I am currently carrying the 508T, and I do change it out about every 2 to 2.5 months just to make sure I don't have a battery die. And I also incorporate a spare battery in my EDC because it's very fast to actually change your battery out. That's one reason I don't mind that my battery only lasts for 3 months. Oddly enough, my 507C will last a little bit longer than 3 months, and that's at the same brightness setting with the same exact batteries. It does include a Panasonic battery. I recommend that you use a Duracell or at least an Energizer Lithium. The Panasonic batteries don't last as long, so just get a better battery. The waterproof rating, I've never submerged either of my optics, but I have gotten them soaking wet out in the rain before, and I even took the 508T to a water park. It just wasn't submerged, and they were both fine. The 508T got so wet that it had chlorine marks all over the glass when it dried, so I know the optics probably are accurate when they say they have a waterproof rating of 1 meter for half an hour or however long it is. The 507C, when I initially got it, I got the 507C X2 when it did come out. I did have experience with the previous model, but that initial 507C X2 I put it on a ZEV slide that was on a Glock 19, and I carried that for about a year and a half, and it held the same exact zero the entire time. I never had an issue with the optic losing zero. It was a great optic. The glass clarity is good. It does have a decent sized window, and that optic is, daylight bright. I would say it's a daylight bright optic, or pretty close to it. It's definitely not as bright as the RMR or like, an EOTech, but it's bright enough to use in the sun. And I did fire over 15,000 rounds on that pistol because it was in 2020 when the 507CX2 came out, and I still had a lot of ammo left over from it before the ammo shortage. So I did fire 15,000 rounds. It was a little bit over than 15,000 rounds on, for that year and a half that I did carry it. The only reason I stopped carrying the 507C was because I went back to the Trijicon RMR for a little while, but after I took it off my carry gun, I did put it on a Glock 34, and I did shoot about, I don't know, maybe 5,000 rounds over the next year on that 507C with the Glock 34, so I do have about 20,000 rounds on the 507C X2. That's why I feel comfortable doing a review, and I can definitely recommend that optic, especially if you were on a budget. I got the 508T X2 not long after I got that 507C, and this is also a great optic. The only difference between the two optics is the housing. The 508T is solid titanium, and that 507C is aluminum, and it's also a great optic. Obviously, it's a little bit different shaped, and this different shape does help with durability. So, according to testings by Sage Dynamics, the 508T does appear to be more durable. So maybe if you're a cop or something like that and you're carrying outside the waistband, maybe get the 508T. It's not too much more money than the 507C, and they're both great optics. Performance-wise, there's going to be no difference. They both have the same buttons. They both take the same battery. The housing is just different. But if you happen to have an astigmatism, I would say these optics are astigmatism friendly. I do have a slight astigmatism, and I don't have any issues. When you're inside and you're actually looking at the dot on your optic, it's going to look way different than when you're outside actually looking through it and shooting. So whenever I go outside, it's a nice crisp dot, but the dot will obviously look different if you're inside and you're staring right at the dot. One thing to do if you have an astigmatism is keep your optic lens clean and make sure to clean off your emitter as well, and the dot will look a lot better. Don't use anything that's not made for cleaning an optic. If you don't have a specific optic cleaner, just use the cloth that comes with it and some water, and that will clean off both the optic glass and the emitter just fine. So just make sure you keep it clean, and it should be fine. When you install it, I don't recommend using the Holosun tool they give you. This does come in handy because it does have a slotted screwdriver on it, so you can zero your optic, and you also can change out the battery. But for installing this optic, I recommend that you get a Torx wrench, at least till you get the hang of applying an equal amount of torque to both screws. Then you can maybe move over to something like a screwdriver. And the screws they include with the optic, they do include a few different types. The ones that they include are pretty decent screws. I've never had an issue with the screws they include. This blue stuff on the screws isn't Loctite though, so I do recommend that you use blue Loctite, the medium strength, or even Permatex medium strength, to make sure that your screws do not back out. If you install it correctly, you shouldn't have any issues with it whatsoever. Other than that, they're both great optics, and I do recommend both these optics, especially if you're on a budget. Compared to say an RMR or an Aimpoint, both those optics are definitely a little bit nicer quality, especially when it comes to the glass and how crisp and bright the reticle is. But the Holosun pistol optics are great. Don't let the fact that they're made in China steer you away. they're both great optics, and I have carried them for a long time. In total, I do have, at least 25,000 rounds of Holosun pistol optics. So I definitely do recommend these optics. Other than that, if you have any questions, go ahead and drop them down below, and I'll happily answer any of them. That'll be it. Thanks, guys.